Hello, everyone. My name is Annette Sandler. I'm the Director of Live Content at AVIXA. Welcome to our February Conferencing and Collaboration Power Hour. This is where technology managers and integrators can get the latest on key developments and trends for the digital workplace. And today we're talking about troubleshooting conferencing systems. This webinar is brought to you by our series sponsor, BlueJeans, and our moderator today is Pete Koman, Chief Technology Officer at PTS Consulting. Before I hand the presentation over to Pete, there are a few housekeeping items. For those of you who are viewing live, today's webinar qualifies for 1 CTS, CTSD, and 1 CTSI RU credit. Please allow 5 to 7 business days to view this on your transcript, and if you have any issues, email us at webinars@avixa.org. During the webinar today, all attendees will be placed on mute. The event chat icon is the speech bubble on your right-hand sidebar, and that's where you can communicate with all attendees. Please introduce yourself in the event chat and let us know what kind of systems you're primarily troubleshooting these days. Are you all on video systems, or are you working on some in-room systems as well? Personally, I'm primarily working through video conferencing systems. Closed captioning is also available for this webinar. If you'd like to turn on captions, click the CC button in the lower left-hand corner. If you have questions for the panel today, please enter those into the Q&A window where your fellow attendees can like and upvote their favorite questions. The Q&A icon is the last icon on your right-hand sidebar, and we'll take audience questions after the panel discussion. Finally, you'll have access to the recorded webinar at avixa.org/webinars within about 5 business days. So that's all I have, and now I'll hand things over to Pete.
G'day everyone, welcome to another AVIXA Collaboration and Conferencing Power Hour. I'm Pete Techman Koman, and I'll be your host for today's webinar, Troubleshooting Conferencing Systems. Special thanks to BlueJeans for sponsoring this series. We really appreciate your support. We have an amazing panel today covering all corners of the country, so let's get straight into it and introduce everybody. First of all, we have Kanika Kana. She's an AV support engineer at the University of Southern California. Second person on the panel today is Shannon Webster, and Shannon works at Instacart as an AV engineer. And then we have Holly Clausen, the project engineer at AVI SPL. And Larry Coates, he's the technical account manager at BlueJeans. So welcome everyone to the panel. I'm glad you can all join us today and share your knowledge with everybody that's viewing today's episode. So the first question I want to ask is to Kanika. In universities that I've personally worked with in Australia, they have support cameras as well as real-time sort of support tools such as Crestron Fusion deployed throughout the campus to monitor and diagnose problems sometimes before problems even occur. So, and they can also remote in via a touch panel. What kind of systems does the University of Southern California deploy?
So we actually just completely overhauled our systems from Extron-based to Crestron over this past summer. So before we used to have Crestron GVE as our primary monitoring, but we also have security cameras that we use in the classroom that we have the ability to kind of live monitor from as well. But the really cool thing that we did with this new upgrade is that we have Hudley cameras in all of our spaces that we can now, in addition to using them for conferencing and doing remote classes and such, we can actually use those as part of troubleshooting, and they come with a much higher quality, which has been great for us. And now with our new Crestron systems, we do have Crestron Fusion for monitoring, and we have xPanel that we do use to remote into. So between that, it covers a lot of our bases, but my other favorite remoting in software is probably Crestron Remote Control, which is a kind of dumber version of TeamViewer, but it lets you log into any Crestron UC engine, which is what's running Zoom rooms for all of our systems. So to be able to control the computer that's actually in the room remotely has been really helpful for me.
And so you found, I mean, obviously typically a university campus is pretty spread out, so it can take some time to actually physically go to a particular teaching space, teaching and learning space. So is that your first line of defense? Like when you get that call, is that what you just talk me through what your process is?
Right. So I'm typically the second line, a tier 2 support. So the first folks who have already gone out there are our student workers or our first tier of full-time staff who will go out, support the client or the professor, whoever's in there, work with them. And if they can't resolve the issue, that's typically when it gets escalated to me. If there's someone in the room and it needs to be resolved right now, my first line of defense is definitely remote work. But typically, if it's something a little bit more complicated than that, we kind of throw a work around solution in place and I go do some more deep troubleshooting later. But definitely my first line of defense, if I have to do something right here, right now, is to remote in and use any tool at my disposal before I actually have to get into the room. Because typically I'll have a representative there who I can say, can you unplug that and try and plug it back in? So I can do more of the heavy lifting in the background.
Have you tried restarting a computer? Is that one of the questions that's asked?
Fortunately, my staff will have typically done that before I have to jump on that call, which I'm very grateful for.
Very good. And Shannon, you're on the client side of the fence there. So just tell us a little bit about Instacart and the conferencing systems that you guys deploy, and how has your support model changed in the last 12 months with people working remotely?
For sure. So starting with the rooms and what you would typically see, in that infrastructure. So we mostly use like kits, particularly Google Meet, where it has like a all-in-one speaker mic over RJ45. We're a Samsung house. We like to keep all the same display models. That way, we know where the settings are and it's all good across the board. And then, for a combinable space, like a training room or something like that, we have beamformer mics, Crestron control system, and of course, like a little monitor so we know when it's opened or closed. And then as far as our all-hands space, we have, of course, confidence monitors and encoder that's on a VPN so we can hit it remotely and stream and broadcast that way. Mac Mini to, for Zoom Room, because we're trying to move away from that. DSP, touch panel, little hub for all of our inputs, so people can swap out computers if needed. And, of course, projector and screens. But
and how
as far as
what about like in the last 12 months, obviously with people working remotely, so how has that changed? I mean, has that changed your design, your infrastructure that you're deploying at all?
Absolutely. So when we were in the office, things were more hardware based, and now that we're remote, things are software based. And as a measure to kind of alleviate that process of going remotely, we've done a lot of documentation, that will say in the office, here's a picture of everything that's going on, and then work from home. And of course the first line there is, have you rebooted, all that kind of thing that we're used to. But as far as like changing our day-to-day, we've enabled voice control for contactless use. So when people do return back to the office, they have that option. And of course our sweeps have changed. We have to sanitize everything after we are in a room. And as far as like changing the remote work from home for the end user, for key presenters, who we see more often in our webinars and everything, we've shipped them out all in one units, like a Chrome base or a D10Me, for example. That way we can just elevate their quality a little bit, and it's still easy to use.
You mentioned there that you're using, it sounds like you're using smart assistants, voice activation. That fascinates me because obviously with everything that's happened over the last 12 months, we're trying to create a contactless and a contactless environment. And I believe that voice is one of those ways that we can achieve that. I mean, what are you deploying and how are you deploying it?
It's pretty simple. So if you have like a Google Assistant, the little Nest, it's very similar. It's just a checkbox and an OU, on the admin portion of the Google Home, or not Google, the Google Hub. So, you know, it's just a checkbox. And once you turn it on, people can do things like, hey, start my meeting, end my meeting. You know, they're still working out like the volume up, down, and all that little more complicated kind of stuff. But for the most part, it's really simplistic. And what I love about it is you can say, hey, Google, what can you do? And then you'll get a little bar that says, here are some good voice commands. So, you know, there isn't really training needed.
I love that. I mean, as I said, I've been talking about voice for probably the last 12 months and how it's going to impact, but we haven't really seen any projects deploy it. So I'd love to hear more about that at a later date, because I think that's something that we all want to see up and running to make it easy. I mean, we use them at home, right? So why aren't we deploying them in the workplace? So that's amazing. I'm really glad that someone's finally deploying voice in the workplace. So excellent. Well done. Holly, we've obviously seen an increase in popularity of soft codecs. Has supporting these systems become harder or easier when compared to traditional video conferencing systems?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, Pete. So I wouldn't say it's gotten more difficult, but I think that if you ask the average AV integrator, they would say it's gotten more difficult. In my opinion, we've basically just had to change the way that we were thinking about these. Like Shannon was just saying, we've changed from a hardware-based solution to a software-based solution. So while we have all spent the last 20, 30 years really mastering, these cable terminations, these cable pulls, understanding how these signals get from point A to point B, now we're having to rethink kind of how we troubleshoot, look at the codec itself or the conferencing platform itself and see maybe what settings we need to change, what gear we're pairing with this solution. So it, in a way, has gotten more difficult, but it has led us to be needing to be more creative, especially on the design side.
And are you seeing PCs being deployed in these spaces to enable sort of one-touch meeting joins, or are you seeing more BYOD devices? So people are bringing their own laptops to run the meetings from their own device.
I have seen both. In my opinion, I have seen that, a client that would like to have a more robust system, a system that you quote unquote know is going to work, you might not go down the BYOD path. Mm-hmm. You want to have a system that you have more control over, maybe something that you have more practice working with. What I've been speccing in a lot this year that I had not specified previously are PCs, as well as PCs that go into OPS slots within displays. That has increased in popularity this year as well.
Interesting. Okay, that's cool. Larry, what's from the manufacturer side? What's the number one technical issue that you're experiencing, or that you have to experience with the clients? So what are they calling you about typically?
For me personally, I kind of deal with two different types of clients. One, the enterprise or organization themselves, and then the end user as well. So from an enterprise or organization perspective, typically the first technical issue they're going to bring to me are, what permissions do I need to connect to your service? What IP addresses scattered across the globe, items like that. And then what type of permissions do we need to apply to like an HTTP proxy? Mm-hmm. And then also VPN clients. What permissions need to be allowed for these users, whether they're on site or at home, to connect to your service? For end users at home, the one issue, I guess the primary issue we face frequently is connection performance. All of the kids are playing games. My connection with Pete goes to the devil. So, we deal with that frequently. But those are typically the type of connection issues or technical issues we face first off, and then it can obviously grow into others.
And how do you troubleshoot that? So if someone has a poor internet connection, what can you do? Is there anything that you can do?
Yeah, well, the first thing, if you're on wireless, and I think I'd seen some communication, if you're on wireless, the easiest troubleshooting you can do, connect a wire from your computer or your device to the router or whatever home access point you've got. Most people assume that wireless works wonderfully in all scenarios, and it's a great mobile move around technology, but there are some constraints that it has in general. So hooking a wire or connecting a wire up straight away is a good troubleshooting technology. Another thing we do, we have many clients that go on site to a customer's location that have very aggressive restrictive constraints, especially in bandwidth. And you say, well, what do you do with those individuals? Well, if they can carry a mobile hotspot, hook that up, connect their computer to the mobile hotspot, you step past any constraints that enterprise may have, and then you can judge the connection capability at that point.
And with the enterprise clients, I mean, what kind of difficulties are you having from the IT side of things? Are you finding that there are certain restrictions with the client's networks that cause problems? I mean, what are you seeing out there on the enterprise side?
Yeah, on the enterprise side, some of the bigger items you see, especially from an HTTP proxy standpoint. So this means all of your web traffic is inspected. If you can imagine, many organizations have constraints that you can't go shopping. You can't go online shopping at work. Some organizations have very aggressive restrictions. So those get handled normally at the proxy layer. What are you permitted to do? So including your connection locations in an exception to the HTTP proxy, that'll allow you to connect back and forth, and then that'll help. Then when you move into the media performance, traditionally media is going to be of a protocol type for UDP for just send and forget. And that protocol sometimes can be constrained in the enterprise environment. So identifying what your service needs to operate effectively, that's the biggest issue we deal with at the enterprise level.
Interesting. Okay. And Kanika, I mean, if we cast our mind back to pre-COVID, tell me about your experiences. You receive a call. From an academic, they're in a lecture hall, there's 400 students in there, and they're telling you that the system's not working. What do you do?
Fortunately, we're prepared for that. We have these wonderful little things called crash carts, which is basically a system on the run. You have them stationed very strategically around campus, and if you need to deploy it, you deploy it just so you can at least get class running, because there's one thing that you know of when you're at these private institutions or just higher education in general, is that people are paying a lot of money for these classes. There's a lot on the line to make sure that they stay up and stay running. So if we have a major issue that takes a whole room down, it's a crash cart in the room, get that thing back up and going while you try and transition to getting whatever was broken back up and running.
I mean, because there's no pressure. I mean, there's only
none whatsoever.
Yeah. Okay, so you just wheel that in and then try to get the class back up and running, and then you're working on the side trying to resolve the problem.
Exactly. Like if I'm in a room and I can't fix it in the first minute, I'm just going to say, get a crash cart, get this professor up and running now, let me do my thing in the background. It's not like I have 400 millennials staring at me trying to figure out why I can't get the technology working. No pressure whatsoever. But it is definitely.
They're all offering suggestions as well, right?
Fortunately, by the time you get to the size of about 400, they're all just shaking their heads, being like, oh, why can't they figure this out? But if you have a smaller class of 30, then yeah, that's when you get the suggestions and you're like, thank you. I've been doing this for longer than you've been alive, but all right, let's go for this. But no, in terms of what to do if the room stops working, it's definitely crash cart to get the ball rolling and keep working in the background as much as I can.
And how many crash carts would you have available, to
let's see. We fortunately have typically not needed to use many with the systems in the past, but like I kind of had mentioned to you earlier, we just did a completely brand new install. So we're still learning the ins and outs of this new system. So we'll have to see what happens when everyone comes back to campus. But I think we have, I'm relatively new to this department at USC, so I want to say at least 5, but I haven't seen more than 1 used at any point in time.
Gotcha. Okay. And are you taking the opportunity with, I'm guessing that the majority or all the students are all off-site at the moment. Are you taking the opportunity to upgrade spaces?
Correct. It was actually, as my boss will say, pure dumb luck that we kind of had this timed the way it did. Yeah. Before we went into COVID, we were planning on upgrading all of our classrooms this summer anyway to make them all Zoom room capable. then spring break happened and everyone didn't come back, and we were like, maybe we should start on that now. And the university got wind that we were planning on doing Zoom rooms anyway, and they were like, you should have done that yesterday. So it was a planned upgrade that had pressure thrown on it immediately once COVID hit.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And what about yourself, Holly? I mean, you get a client rings up and they've got a problem, and big client, and you've actually got to resolve it. I mean, what do you do? What are you looking for?
Right. Well, like as Kanika was saying, I mean, you would assume that if somebody is calling me or calling somebody on this call, they've already gone through level 1, right? They verified that the connections are solid. They verified that, everything's powered on. The thing that I think that we as AV professionals need to look into is what has changed in the system, right? As we know, code doesn't change on its own. So when you walk into a system that was working, let's say yesterday or a few days ago, and you see that now maybe it's not working the same, you need to look at what other aspects of the AV system could have caused this. For example, if you have any blimps in power, a power blackout or a brownout, I mean, really anything can cause these devices to get out of sync. Maybe your IT department has, released any kind of new update with the network that could cause the IP addresses to change, and now your systems can't communicate. Just these things that we set once and forget, we need to not overthink. So when we go back into the system, just make sure that you're looking at the simple issues, understanding exactly what it is that's happening with your system. Gotcha.
And Shannon, when a user contacts you about a problem, how do you determine whether that's a hardware problem, a software problem, or a user problem? I mean, obviously it's never a user problem, but just hypothetically, just say it was a user problem. How do you determine where that issue actually lies?
Well, in enterprise, I find that user error is a little more common, at least in my day-to-day. But the biggest key indicator to find if it was user error is to determine how large the subset of users who are experiencing the problem is. So if it's isolated to a smaller group, then it possibly could be user error. And of course, to previous points, is it on? Is it on the network? When was the last time you updated Chrome or your browser? When was the last time you operated the system, firmware, software, all that kind of stuff is like the basis. And then, refer them to documentation, for basic things. And if that didn't resolve the issue, then, to previous points, and isolate the issue. So trace, take your signal flow source to destination, keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller until you can definitively say, this was the issue. So bypass, replicate, search the internet, especially if there was an error message, try to pinpoint that, and then, keep it simple is really the best way to go about it.
So other than a user error, what would you say was the most common problem that you come across?
Good question. So at least in my space, it's mostly been handshake when it's in the rack. So just power cycling because they're on all day. Mm-hmm. And as far as like conference rooms, it's usually like a dongle or one of the cables in the speaker mic got damaged, and pretty simple swap.
And I mean, you mentioned cables. I mean, do you deploy higher quality cables, for example? I mean, if that's a point of failure, I mean, how do you overcome those kinds of things, or can you overcome those kinds of things with using maybe different hardware?
I mean, like we're definitely looking into eliminating as many cables as possible, just because that's a single point of failure. But as far as like, I mean, we use like vetted dongles, and we have them like tethered, so we know they're not walking away. I think retractors is something we're looking into, just so we can, have it not out and about on the desk, so they can get kinky and damaged.
Okay. And Larry, you must come across a few issues. How do you determine whether or not it's hardware, software, or a user problem?
It's a big question. Obviously, it's in an enterprise pretty quick. You can identify, do you even get out so you could do alternative test calls. If they can't connect to your service, can they connect to anyone's service? So that's pretty simple. Then you can backtrace, like a lot of been talked about. What changed? Did it work yesterday, the week before? Is it just started? Most connectivity clients have logging infrastructure or logging data, so reviewing that information as far as what do you see the client, because on the client side, that gives you a lot of great information that you don't get to see from the server side. I can see everything from the server side, but the client side is kind of invisible until you can get those client logs, and getting those and evaluating, like the handshake, somebody mentioned handshakes a lot of times, evaluating those and where is the failure happening. That'll help you identify, is it a system or is the user struggling themselves?
And from the client side, who are you finding is responsible? When I say client, I'm referring to more enterprise side of things. Who is responsible for these systems? Do they have dedicated AV people? Is it the IT team? Who are you dealing with trying to troubleshoot these issues?
Typically with a large enterprise, they've got a video system support group. Now that support group can either deal with the end users and the rooms, quote, the room infrastructure themselves, and then sometimes they can be segmented into different groups. But typically a large enterprise is going to have a video system support group, and those will be the groups that I interface with primarily on an enterprise customer. Okay. Same with the academic locations as well. Typically, they're going to have a dedicated support group like Kanika's mentioned.
Mm-hmm. And Holly, we're seeing a lot more devices sitting on the client's network. Have your skill sets or your team's skill sets, have they had to change to accommodate this trend for things like speakers, microphones, from a control point of view, where all these devices are now available to reside on the network? So have those skill sets needed to change, and also what network related issues do you typically come across?
Right. Yeah, I would say that as an AV professional, our skill set has had to change, especially in the last 5 years. I often joke that it's really only a few short years away from us all being IT professionals as well, especially because so many of our communications has gone from just a basic copper cable based to HD base T based. And when you have HD base T communication, you need to take bandwidth into consideration. As Larry was talking about earlier, especially with our soft codec communication systems, we see a lot of issues with bandwidth. But what a lot of end users don't realize is bandwidth is also a communication, even if you're doing just a local presentation, especially using HD base T communications. For example, just going from 1080p to 4K can increase your bandwidth significantly. And so all of a sudden you have a network which has been there for years working great, now cannot put the proper video signal to the display. So I would say a base understanding of how these network systems work is needed for AV engineers these days in order to implement the proper systems.
And what about the physical infrastructure? So the cabling that's in place. Like you mentioned before, HC base T, for example. I mean, if you're running at 4K, you sort of 10 gig and up. How much influence does that cabling infrastructure have for these systems to operate correctly? And how much knowledge is required to, once again, to troubleshoot, you're having an intermittent problem. I mean, do you need to know about cabling?
No, 100% you do. I mean, recently I was looking at an RFP that was talking about maybe, putting signals across multiple floors. And you're exactly right. The existing Cat6A cable will not be able to carry that network traffic. So we needed to have a conversation from going to Cat6A to a fiber-based connection, because you're absolutely correct. With these larger bandwidth networks that we're deploying, we need to look at, technology that was designed to carry these systems and signals.
And just on that, do you mentioned sort of going to fiber, but if you can get away with using copper, due to the cable runs, how influential are you with the client to say, look, this is how you should deploy these systems? Like, for example, obviously the communications industry has a lot of standards in place. Are you recommending that they meet those standards, because typically with HC base T, it's more of a point-to-point communication. It's not really sitting on the network. So So what conversations do you have with your clients regarding the physical infrastructure, the cabling infrastructure?
Right. Well, like you're saying, as you're pointing out, we don't always get to have these conversations with the client. Unfortunately, from the AV side, sometimes we are brought in a little bit too late in the game to have these conversations.
That never happens, is it? That never happens. We're always first at the table, right?
Right, which is why, in my opinion, I think the most important thing that we can do as an integrator or as an engineer or really an AV professional in general is just understand how to have these conversations with the IT professionals, right?
Mm-hmm.
The people who either can make the decisions or have already made the decisions. Then you can design a system that will either fit the existing system, or you can talk about what you can do to push it forward.
Okay. And Kanika, just with the same question, how does USC deploy their systems? I mean, are you utilizing the network? And if so, what changes has your team, the support team, had to make to accommodate, like sort of with devices sitting on the network?
So I can only partially answer that question because one of the whole reasons we actually did this recent upgrade was to get everything on an IP-based system. In terms of what the team has done to change around that, I can't really say too much about because we've only had to support 5 rooms that we're using for production spaces since we haven't really had them used in full yet. So for the most part, for the stuff that we have been doing, it's been a lot more just power cycling it just to get started, but we haven't had to dig too much into what our typical problems would be just because we haven't had that much usage yet.
Okay. And Shannon, what about yourself? I mean, are you deploying, like sort of Dante speakers or microphones and things like that? And what skill sets do you have to support these systems?
Yeah. So I mean, certifications are great. Not only does it count towards your RU, if you're a CTS or et cetera holder, but yeah, we to the point we have been using fiber for most of our connections, to go cross floors, and we have used Dante enabled devices. We don't have a Dante bus or server yet. But I think that would be, an action item for us, particularly because we have some devices that support it, and it's great to have everything all in one place.
And I think I'll add to what Shannon said. Actually, is in terms of supporting it, we've definitely been encouraging our team to get certifications and sort of the stuff we're deploying. We have Dante that's now going to be campus wide. We have Crestron, we've had everyone kind of dabbling in their basic training as well, just to get familiar with the platform and such. So absolutely agree with her.
Yeah, it is interesting the way everything's going. And someone mentioned earlier that we're becoming more of a IT industry and moving away from the AV side of things. But obviously, they need to meld together to work as one. I think it's important that the AV industry does understand not just the active side of things, but also the passive infrastructure as well. I think it is very important. Larry, with the majority of the workforce working remotely, I'm guessing that Blue Jeans has seen an increase to support more consumer-centric devices, i.e. wireless headphones. Can you tell us more about how Blue Jeans has had to deal with a plethora of devices that now require support?
It's kind of interesting. We probably hit that first in the office with the wireless headsets that everybody has connected to their phones. So now that's kind of extended to the home, and obviously it's covered a bunch of different manufacturers. So the way we deal with it, obviously, is if we're having a dramatic issue with a wireless device, you can obviously change the transmission frequencies that it's operating on, but you've got to step the user through how do I do that. Most devices will provide that. So we have capability to step the users through those type of things, check the latest, firmware or software version they're running on as far as that device itself. But probably the biggest issue that we've run into is the device control itself. They normally have their own mute, dial, volume controls on it. They want to know why the clients don't support those directly. So BlueJeans has a large initiative going on for the USB HID initiative, where we can pick up what you're using on the device itself. So those are kind of the biggest issues we've run into on those. Obviously, support between the Apple earbuds, and some of those can cause issues. We've run into some of those in different, especially different OSs, which is kind of interesting. Linux, you get different performance if somebody using an earbud than you would on, say, Mac or Windows platform.
And Shannon, are you seeing more support calls now that people are working remotely, trying to use their consumer technologies that they may have at home compared to the more controlled work environment?
Absolutely. I mean, it's not that we don't have any more break fix. It's just the nature of our break fix has changed. And to the point, I mean, obviously there's Apple earbuds are really, or AirPods are really popular, and I can't, even myself, I'm on a call and I'm like, hold up, let me turn it off, let me turn it on. There's a lot of that. We even had an interesting problem come up where, someone was using a virtual machine and trying to use VC, and it was just causing all kinds of things. I mean, things you normally wouldn't see are now surfacing.
Yeah, I can imagine it's a real problem where people are just trying to plug in their devices at home and in an uncontrolled environment. So whether it be webcams or speakers, microphones. So it makes it a lot more, I can imagine it makes it a lot more challenging from a support point of view. And it would certainly, I suppose, expand your knowledge, really, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, our support cases have doubled quarterly since pandemic started. So it's been some interesting challenges for sure.
Can imagine. And Kanika, you'd previously told me that at USC there's typically no standards across the faculties. So how do you support such a wide variety of systems? And what I'd like to know is how important is things like as-built documentation when it comes to troubleshooting?
Critical. We'll start with that. But in terms of, so right now the way USC works is that we don't, as you said, we don't really have anything standard, but we're trying to work together with other academic units and divisions to try and bring a standard design to all of campus. But until then, we have, the engineering school has done their own thing for the last 30 years or so. So their systems are entirely different from what my team with the general use classrooms takes care of. So a lot of what ends up happening right now is with its current structure is that if you're in a space, you have to know who's in charge of that space in order to ask them for their tech support. So the unfortunate downside to that is because I do work for the general campus-wide ITS division, sometimes if the person who's in a room doesn't know who their specific go-to is, they'll end up coming to us just because we are the generic help desk for campus. So what that means for me is, yes, as-built documentation is incredibly important, but that's assuming I'm even lucky enough to get a hold of that, because what'll happen is someone will come in for a call, I need this now, and we don't even have time. We're just kind of trying to help them with general principle, turn it off, turn it on again type of stuff, because we don't even know necessarily what they're looking at. So.
Okay. And Holly, look, with a project that AVISPL have done, how do you access that documentation? So obviously, I've seen some of the work that you guys have done. You create very detailed schematics, as-built documentation. Where does that reside? When someone's troubleshooting one of these projects, how do you access that? Have you got a central repository somewhere that you access? How do you call that up to assist with the troubleshooting? And the second part to that is, what happens when you're dealing with a project that's not yours, that you haven't installed? What do you do from there where you don't have access to the documentation?
Right. Well, to be honest with you, I don't work for our service department, so I'm not exactly sure what they do when somebody just calls in our help desk. But when somebody does call me, all of our local as-built are actually saved to one location that we can all access. So any project that was done outside of Seattle, I have access to. Obviously, if I need as-built documentation from a different office, I need to contact either that office, the individual, or I need to contact IT in order to get that. More often than not, though, especially if we were not the integrator that did the previous work, it could be very difficult to get that documentation if we're lucky enough to get it. You know, previously I spent 3 weeks on a client site making my own, because sometimes that just is what it takes. Especially if you want to reuse gear, you need to know what's there and you need to know for sure.
One thing that's frustrated me over the years is when you have an AV contractor, they've done the code and it's all locked and they won't release it to anybody. And from my point of view, the customer's paid for that, so the customer should own it. What do you do in those situations where you have maybe one of your competitors and they won't release the code? How do you handle? How do you troubleshoot that? How do you resolve the problem?
Well, I mean, you know, it kind of depends on the issue. You know, if we need to make a change to the code, obviously not having the code that we need, not being able to do that is an issue. But if you're troubleshooting, hopefully, if you're lucky, you won't need to change the code. Then we can just kind of go around and go through our normal stance to make sure that we can see what it is that did change, what that didn't change, what we can and cannot resolve. Unfortunately, if we cannot get the code and we do need to create it, the only resolution would be for us to create a new one.
Not again.
That doesn't happen too often, though, I would say. You know, even AV integrators were pretty friendly.
Okay, that's good. That's good to hear. As I said, I've been in situations where code hasn't been shared, and the client is the one that's left out, right? And someone's got to pay for it, so it's unfortunate. So Shannon, it seems like every laptop that's released these days is got some sort of unique resolution and aspect ratio. So how do you cater to ensure, how do you cater for EDID problems and also HDCP issues? What do you put in place to try to mitigate connectivity issues?
For sure. So I think the biggest thing, at least for enterprise, is to make sure that everybody is on a similar make and model, have a standard process for when we upgrade. We're a Mac house, so there are some issues with HDCP sometimes, as you see with Mac. But I think the biggest thing is just supporting is pulling EDID information from the hardware. That way you can kind of look at it and be like, and kind of cross-reference. Keep it native if you can, use a scaler. And then there's obviously various EDID management softwares that can help you trace and fix. For example, Extron has some stuff. And then the software tool can help you determine if it's the EDID, if it's the graphic card, maybe it's a handshake. And of course, it's really prevalent since everybody's BYOD, you have various modes of communication. But I mean, I think, as far as issues, for example, there's no image displayed. It's possible that the display is losing the image when a new source has been selected. The hot plug detection. That's kind of being phased out since VGA is becoming a thing of the past. But there can be hot plug devices signaling for DVI, HDMI, DisplayPort. Inconsistencies between the manufacturers. Stuff like that.
Okay. And Kanika, Shannon mentioned that in their environment, they're a Mac house, and the hardware that's distributed, like the laptops and so on, is somewhat controlled. I can imagine in your environment, it is totally opposite, right? I'm guessing that everyone.
Wild West out there.
Yeah. How do you resolve EDID issues and HDCP issues and all that kind of stuff? What do you put is there any hardware in place, or what do you do?
We haven't really put any hardware in place to resolve any EDID issues for the most part. We've been, I guess what comes with the nature of the beast with a university as large as ours is we kind of just have to There's so much out there, and you can't standardize really on much of anything, especially when your users are free to do essentially whatever they want with their own equipment. Like we don't have the corporate control of this is the laptop we're going to issue you.
Yeah.
So our solutions to these things are really getting to know these OSs and trying to figure out how to help them fix their settings to get them onto the right way. The other option that we always have is if it comes to it, we also have laptops that we can lend out.
Right.
So between those two solutions, we typically tend to have everything covered, but it's pretty much a requirement within the department. I would say that everyone is well versed enough to be able to get into any computer's display settings, make sure everything syncs up with whatever it is that's going on in our system. The only kind of application that we have right now is with the recent upgrade that I mentioned we just did, is we did kind of set everything to a generic consumer EDID. I can't remember exactly what the resolution is off the top of my head, but it does tend to capture and work with most consumer electronics.
Forcing the resolution onto the user's device.
Correct, essentially. Doesn't work for everything, and again, we haven't had that much use case since we've been in COVID, since the installs really happened. But for the few people that we have had coming into our spaces, it's helped, and I can only imagine we'll continue using our own laptops and the support model won't change, I imagine.
Gotcha. And Larry, what I'd like to know is, would you recommend that your clients, I know your clients are very broad, it could be enterprise, it could be the consultant, it could be the installer, but where do you guys sit in recommending, like say, one-touch meeting join options to help eliminate potential problems, user problems?
It probably, when I go on site, it was always interesting with the large organizations, whether it be enterprise or traditional business customers or even academic. Probably the biggest item I noticed is when the users came into, say, the room space. How do seem to be the question they ask the most. How do I call here? How do I share this? Or how do I connect this? So coming up with, say, the one-touch join just to start the meeting, because if you remember, probably, I think we did a lot of surveys on getting the meeting started, especially the CIO level and the C-suite. They want to know, did the meeting start on time? Why didn't it start on time? Is everybody organized? Is something wrong? So getting the meeting effectively kicked off on time. So one-touch join, what we've done is, even for, just our sessions or interfacing into, say, a Teams environment or a Zoom environment, any other environment, if the user can walk into the touch display and click one button and start the meeting, then that effectively does a lot for them from a one-touch join scenario. Now, it does take some integration between your mail system, your scheduling system, and the touchpads that may be in the room. Now, whether or not the touchpads are going on a normal conference room, a Cisco or Tandberg Polycom type device, or they're going into, say, a Zoom room or a Blue Jeans room or any type of room, getting that touchpad interfaced into your scheduling system. Once you get that done, then that will simplify the user's utilization of that room dramatically.
And have you seen a drop in support calls for rooms that are deployed, that are automated somewhat?
Definitely internal, because a lot of times, like, especially this team here, a lot of times they're going to call their internal support group versus me. But yes, their internal support group, if the users can just walk into the room, hit go, then, that's pretty amazing. Then you take that a step further into the touchless environment that you had mentioned earlier and going forward. Now we've got technologies we're implementing where Pete's running late to a meeting. He runs into a conference room.
That never happens, Larry. I'm always on time.
Yeah, I know you're always on time. But you run into a room with your cell phone, with your mobile app for whatever service you're running. The room then responds to Pete and says, do you want to join your meeting in this room? And you say yes, and you put your phone down, and the room joins into the meeting automatically. Okay. That is where everything's going from a touchless environment.
Yeah, I really like that. I know that quite often if I'm out on site, I'll join a meeting from my phone, and we've actually had our clients request that functionality. So they maybe join from, like you say, they're running late, or they're joining from their desk, and then they want to go into the meeting space. As soon as they walk into that space, they want to actually utilize the infrastructure that's in the room. I mean, I see that as a real benefit to a lot of our clients.
Right, yeah, like the one touch you were just talking about, that's one of the features that even if you're not running late, even if you're walking into a room to take your stand-up meeting and your phone just prompts you and you say yes, make the call, that's an effective way. And also that helps for the touchless environment. You're carrying your own phone, so you're dealing with it as the interface to the room, so that takes away you touching other items. And it also helps the facility as far as having to come in and, you know, clean that room to the degree it's going to need to be cleaned going forward.
Okay, that's interesting. I love that. I love this set of touchless environments that we're now creating. So there's a lot of opportunity out there for all of us, I think, and making a better. At the end of the day, it's all about creating a better user experience. So, so I think we're moving in the right direction. So Kanika, so most of us have been on a call where we have bad sounding audio. Okay. What's involved with determining if it's a setup problem, like hardware, software, versus the acoustics of a space? How do you determine where that issue actually resides?
For me, it's kind of silly to say it, but the first thing I do is I listen, right? The best way to identify what's going on is to at least hear it, see if you can.
You jump on a call. You jump on a call and be that far end. Is that what you're doing?
Well, it depends on who the far end or where the problem is, if it's with the near end or if it's with the far end. But for the most part, typically, yes, I will try and jump on the call. Or if I'm in the room with the person who's on the call, I'll just listen to what they're hearing. But essentially, at some way, shape, or form, I need to listen to what's happening, because ultimately it determines if it's cutting out or if it's dropping out or if it's choppy. That will tend to lead me more towards a network issue as a system issue. But if there's never-ending feedback, or there's certain, like, I don't know how to tell the to explain quite the difference between a acoustic filter in a room versus a dropout with the network, but you have to be able to listen to hear what those two differences are. And once you can kind of place it in one of those two categories, it really helps determine like what your next step is. If it's something that's with the room, like you can just hear a giant echo, like if I were to clap, it wouldn't happen in my living room, but if I were to clap and hear a huge echo, you know it's the acoustics of the room. There's really only so much you can do. You have the person center in on their microphone a little bit more, take out as much of the room as you can. But if it's something that's a little bit more cut out, dropping, you can pretty much narrow it down to their wireless or whatever their connection is into the call, and that there's only so much you can do again in that situation either. So I would say my overall number one troubleshooting step for terrible audio is listen to see what the issue is rather than just say it's not working.
So there's no replacement for the human ear. That's what you're saying.
Never.
Gotcha. And Holly, so if I've got a bad sounding room, I mean, can I somehow use DSP to filter out the effects of poor acoustics?
For the most part, you should be able to. You know, for me, I love a DSP. Mostly when you're talking with soft codecs, we're talking about acoustic echo cancellation, or AEC, which I think all of us deal with. Our number one issue probably with these soft codec calls that we get.
Yes.
You know, a lot of times when you're looking at these microphones, even some microphones like, Shure, I know makes some that do have their own built-in AEC. What they're doing is they're guessing what your reference is. And all of us that work in AV, we know that AEC needs a reference point. So when you have DSP and you're no longer guessing where your reference is, you're pointing your mic to your reference, that can eliminate, 90% of your AEC issues. Going past, if you are having acoustic issues, you can put in high pass or low pass filters. There's a lot of things you can do in a DSP to kind of trick your system into thinking you have a more acoustical balanced location. Obviously, you can only do so much, right? So if you're in a hole, you're in a hole.
Yeah,
I'll add on to that a little bit, sorry, just because I come from a primarily music and live background where there is only so much you can do to fix a room. Like if it is engineered with a bunch of reflective material, you can't DSP your way out of that. What you can do is buy a blanket, or you can buy some other kind of absorption material and throw it up on the wall. But to Holly's point, DSP can only get you so far.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I know in my office here, I have a lot of glass around me, and I actually have some acoustic panels. You could probably see one here, but that I have to try and absorb, the poor properties of this space. So, and it makes a huge difference. Something as relatively simple as these panels.
Yep.
And to
Absolutely.
build off of that a little bit further, because to the point of glass everywhere, that's the design aesthetic. If you have the ability to partner with the other vendors, and suggest politely different surfaces, like, don't be afraid to do so. I've done it, and we're all seeing the benefits now that the build out is passed.
Wait, you found out who the construction company was?
Yeah. I hire them. So, I guess I'm in a little different circumstance. I'm able to.
This is true.
I think we've all walked into a space with concrete floors and glass walls, and it's like, oh, look at this beautiful space, and it's like, oh my God, this sounds terrible. Like, how are we going to have any audio?
How are you going to fix it?
Yeah, exactly. So quite often, so I think what we're all saying there is that if we have, as an industry, if we have a seat at the table early on, then we can help mitigate some of these potential issues before they become a problem during the design phase.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. And Shannon, what I would like to know is the manufacturer, is that your first line of defense or your final line of defense? So when you have a problem, like, are you picking up, are you ringing up Larry and saying, hey, Larry, I've got this problem? Like, how do you approach that?
For sure. So manufacturer support, it really depends on the issue. But if the issue is isolated to the user and I've done a remote session with them and couldn't find the issue, I will call the manufacturer, but usually last, just because, sometimes there's wait times, and sometimes the user doesn't want to be a part of that. So sometimes you have to be a liaison. And, to Larry's point earlier, I'd probably be on the phone with someone with your skill set. But if I'm on site, it'll be last unless it's a repeated issue with a certain device that I can pinpoint out, because then I might need to arm it, or but knowing who to call is kind of a big thing. To points earlier of what was the last thing that changed. If I know that somebody just pushed code, I'm not going to call the manufacturer first. I'm going to call the programmer, or somebody who can get in with Toolbox or whatever and help me out.
Gotcha. Holly, first or final line of defense?
Usually for me, it will be my final. That is because I would like to go through my own troubleshooting first. Like Shannon was saying, mostly for me, it's the wait times. If you could call and talk to somebody immediately, I might call them more, sooner on in the troubleshooting process. But, just having to wait. Sometimes you want to see if you can solve it yourself.
And Kanika, I'm guessing it's your final line of defense as well?
In a normal situation, it's my final line of defense. However, right now I'm working very closely with Shure to deploy their IntelliMix DSP, which is very new for them. So I actually go to them a little bit first on this side, just because we're kind of discovering things together.
That product makes me very excited, and I'm sure. I'm guessing Shannon is probably looking at that kind of technology as well. Would that be right? strongly recommend. I have nothing but good things to say about it. The team has been amazing support-wise. It's been probably my favorite product to work with in combination with their MXA microphones. So
oh, yeah.
If anyone wants to find out more, especially about IntelliMix and working with it, please reach out to me. I am happy to talk more about it, but be excited. It's definitely revolutionizing.
Excellent.
Awesome.
Okay. Yeah. That sounds
They did
good.
not pay me to say that.
A little plug there. Yeah.
We are not paid to do this webinar at all. Larry, we need to wrap things up, but is there anything else in some closing comments that we should be looking at or thinking about when it comes to troubleshooting problems that we might not have discussed today?
Well, probably keeping up with the user experience is the most important, and everybody on this panel deals with it. You know, the feedback that the users provide on the utilization of whichever service you're using, that feedback is critical because that's going to go back up to the executive staff, and that's going to help them decide what works for our group or it doesn't, whether you be an academic or you be in a large enterprise. But getting that user feedback, because changing an entire collaboration platform is not for the faint of heart. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of effort getting everybody integrated. So changing that is not something you do simply. So getting that user experience, paying attention to it, and that's one thing I think that a lot of people have done during the COVID ramp was if the service gave you ways to get that user feedback, as long as you're disseminating it and reacting to it, positive or negative, that can help you going forward.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, guys, I want to thank all of you. I mean, there's some great advice there, some great discussions. Hopefully our listeners have got something out of this. So I'd like to thank Shannon, Holly, Larry, and Kanika for being a part of this panel. I would also like to thank AVIXA for putting this on, and also a big special thanks to Blue Jeans for sponsoring this webinar series. And I hope you all have a great day, and I'll hand it back to Annette.
Thanks, Pete, and thank you everyone for joining today's Conferencing and Collaboration Power Hour. We will be back next month on March 8th to discuss live streaming for corporate tech managers and how you can produce great corporate meetings via streaming. Special thanks again to Blue Jeans for sponsoring this series. The recording will be available on avixa.org/webinars within about 5 business days, and your 1 RU credit will be applied to your transcript within 5 to 7 business days. If you have any trouble, please contact us at webinars@avixa.org. A huge thank you again to Pete, Larry, Holly, Shannon, and Kanika for sharing their insights today. We hope you enjoyed and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.